We all know the Hunger Games, the arenas, the districts, the tributes, the capital's iron grip over the 12 districts, and of course, the rebellion that would eventually bring the games to an end. But there is a deeper question few ever ask. How did it all begin? Not the games itself, but the foundation that caused the rebellion in the first place. The dependency, the control, the unquestioned dominance of the capital long before the Dark Days. Most importantly, why did the districts ever submit to capital rule? It seems absurd to think about accepting your fate in a world where you have no free choice or individualism at all. In this video, we explore the formation of Panem and the psychological, social and political structures that gave rise to one of the most effective regimes in dystopian fiction. Long before the Mockingjay became a symbol. Before the games. Before the Dark Days. Before Panem itself. The world as we knew it came to an end. There is no exact explanation of the official story, but it's clear that something large and devastating changed everything. Our modern society collapsed, not all at once, but slowly, over time. Many countries lost control, and major cities like Washington DC, New York City, and Berlin, for example, fell into chaos. It's unlikely that the nuclear war caused this collapse, since the districts were still habitable as we know from the movies. Radiation would have made large parts of the continent uninhabitable for thousands of years. Instead, the damage was probably caused by environmental disasters, rising sea levels, melting ice caps, and a breakdown of global systems. The maps of Panem show far less land than modern North America, so it's likely that some coastal regions were flooded and no longer appear on any official maps given by the capital. During this time, something new was forming deep in the Rocky Mountains. This area was safe from rising oceans and protected by tall mountain ridges. It's possible that the US government had already built bunkers there in the final years before the collapse. These places may have contained stored medicine, seeds, food, weapons, and technology, but most importantly, knowledge from the old world. As the outside world fell apart, the most powerful people took shelter in these hidden places. Generals, scientists, politicians, and tech billionaires. Some had their own private bunkers, but as time went on and supplies ran low, many of them moved towards what would become the capital, searching for protection and influence. It's very likely that these early communities were able to communicate with each other and therefore knew of each other's existence. They also probably had access to military vehicles, like tanks or hovercraft prototypes we knew from the later movies, which would only appear much later. It is possible that experimental technology like genetic tools or new energy sources survived in storage. But in the beginning, there weren't enough people or resources to actually use this technology at full scale. Only decades later, when the districts were already in place and delivering materials, energy, and workers, was the capital able to unlock this old knowledge and turn it into real power. Other groups and shelters didn't last. Many of them failed because they were too small, too disorganized, or simply didn't have enough time. After a few decades, the capital had become the strongest of them all. What started as a plan for survival slowly turned into something more. In the beginning, the leaders probably believed it was just a temporary system, but as they grew stronger, they began to take control. That control turned into structure, and over time, that structure became a government. You can trace the capital's rise to power back to something pretty simple. It had what no one else did after everything collapsed. Power, order, better technology, and maybe most importantly, a plan. While survivors across the continent were struggling just to find food, fuel, or basic medical help, the capital stayed strong. It had resources, stability, and the ability to keep going. And because of that, people slowly started to rely on it, maybe without fully realizing how much they were giving up in return. The districts, as we now call them, probably started out as small scattered communities, just groups of people who managed to survive the collapse, often built around whatever local resource they had. Fish, coal, wood, or metals, for example. In the beginning, they were on their own, but over time they needed more, and the only place that could provide it was the capital. This connection didn't happen overnight, it grew slowly, out of need. In the first years, the capital focused on securing the basics: food, energy, and raw materials. So the first districts were probably the ones with the most immediate value: agriculture, coal, lumber, things like that. The more complex districts, like those making luxury items or advanced tech, came later, once the capital had more control and could afford to focus on more than just survival. District 1, for example, the one known for producing luxury goods, probably wasn't even created until much later, when the regime was already strong and stable enough to shift from survival to excess. But one district was different from the rest: District 13. It was far more militarized. It may have even been started by people directly connected to the old government or military. They had access to key resources like graphite and nuclear tech, which made them a serious player early on. At first, they were probably closely involved into Panem's defense systems and weapons programs, but later, they broke off and went underground. They kept their independence by staying hidden and holding onto enough strength to make the capital think twice. In the beginning, the system might have looked like a fair deal. The capital gave out tools, medicine, communications, transport, all things people desperately needed. In return, it got the raw materials it needed to rebuild and expand. It felt like cooperation. Eventually, this turned into something much more one-sided. The capital started calling all the shots. It created a rigid structure, each district doing one specific thing, like mining or farming, and nothing else. At first, that might have seemed efficient. Everyone had a job, everything was organized. But that setup wasn't just about keeping things running, it was about keeping control. Over time, the trade between the capital and the districts became unfair. The capital took what it needed, but didn't give much back. And the truth is, it didn't have to. The people in charge had already realized they could keep everything for themselves. The longer the system went on, the more power ended up in the hands of a few. Fear, pride, and control replaced any original ideas of fairness or shared purpose. By the time the districts realized how bad the imbalance had become, it was way too late. The capital had already locked down control. Not just over food and goods, but over the things that really mattered. The trains that delivered supplies, the medicine that kept people alive, the knowledge that explained how the world worked, and even the history people were taught to believe. Step by step, district by district, and resource by resource, the capital system took shape. Quietly, steadily, and without opposition. No one rose to stop it. Not because they approved of it, but because the alternative was chaos. After the collapse of former nations and the disintegration of global order, the capital didn't appear as a tyrant, but as a savior. It portrayed itself as the last remnant of civilization, organized, efficient, and still in possession of the technologies, infrastructures, and knowledge that once defined the old world's power. Most surviving communities had already witnessed the disappearance or destruction of neighboring settlements, lost to anarchy, famine, disease, or conflict. In contrast, the capital stood firm. It offered not just survival, but the illusion of progress. Even if some voices questioned the growing centralization of power, there was little room to act against it. The capital's military superiority and technological control made resistance seem not only dangerous, but futile. This political and economic structure likely endured for at least half a century, if not longer. Over this time, additional districts formed from scattered survivor groups and isolated settlements, each integrated into the existing system and assigned a singular economic function: mining, agriculture, fishing, textiles, energy production. What had initially been framed as a cooperative network built on trade and mutual benefit slowly transformed into a rigid regime of dependence and control. Over time, this control became normalized. Children born into the districts knew no other system. Generations grew up believing that dependence on the capital was not only necessary, but natural. The idea of freedom faded, not only from society, but from thought itself. Crucially, the capital didn't only control resources and infrastructure, it began to dominate information itself. Language, education, and collective memory were gradually monopolized and manipulated. At some point, likely by design, fundamental ideas from the old world, concepts such as democracy, civil rights, religious beliefs, and self-governance were systematically erased or redefined to align the capital ideology. Anything that posed a philosophical or moral threat to its absolute authority was either buried or rewritten to prevent future generations from imagining a world beyond its control. Thus, a new national identity was constructed. And so the question arises, why didn't the people resist sooner? Why was there no uprising before the capital's grip became absolute? The answer lies in the condition of those who had survived the collapse. After the fall of the US government and the unraveling of global civilization, the people were broken, emotionally and culturally. Exhausted from trauma, starving for stability, and stripped of any means to organize, they accepted the capital's orders because it was the only structure that offered continuity. In their eyes, the capital wasn't just a regime, it was a rescue. The districts were isolated, intentionally kept disconnected from one another, with no communication systems to share knowledge, supplies, or anything else. Most people likely didn't even know that other districts existed in any meaningful sense, let alone what conditions they lived under. Without unity, there could be no resistance. Without information, there could be no awareness of injustice. By the time dissatisfaction began to surface, the capital had already established a reality in which resistance felt not only dangerous, but impossible. And in a world where the truth is whatever the regime says it is, even oppression can begin to feel like order. The longer the system endured, the more inevitable it became, until it was no longer seen as a regime at all, but simply as the way the world works. Due to the deeply entrenched system of oppression and the capital's complete control over education, communication, and perception of reality, it took the people of Panem many years, probably almost 1 century, to finally unite and rise up against the capital in pursuit of freedom, what we know as the Dark Days. Yet, the true significance of the uprising lies not just in the fact that it happened, but in how long it took and why. The real story is one of psychological control, not just political oppression. For the capital had embedded itself into the very minds of the people. They didn't only fear the capital's weapons, its soldiers, or its civilians. Far more insidiously, they feared the idea of life without the capital's structure. In the early days of Panem, the capital established its dominance not only through military power and technology, but also by providing what the struggling districts lacked: food, medicine, and safety. These acts of support created a dependency, but they also offered something more subtle: hope. As President Snow would later say, hope is the only thing stronger than fear. The capital understood that too much hope could spark rebellion, but just enough would keep the districts obedient. By giving the people a glimpse of relief, a taste of security, the capital positioned itself as both savior and ruler. Hope became a tool, not of liberation, but of control. We cannot say with certainty whether Panem was truly alone in the world, or if there were other surviving powers capable of challenging the capital's dominance. However, considering the immense scale of devastation across North America, which included environmental collapse, resource depletion, and the breakdown of social and political structures, it is highly probable that other continents experience equal or even greater levels of destruction. Catastrophic droughts, rising sea levels, massive flooding, global food shortages, and the collapse of the government likely left much of the world fractured and disconnected. In the aftermath of such global chaos, communication between continents would have become nearly impossible. Even if isolated societies in places like Africa, Asia, or hidden underground networks in Europe, for example, managed to survive, they may have chosen to remain silent and concealed, avoiding contact with the outside world out of caution. After witnessing a world once ruled by technology and progress descend into ruin, why would any remnant society risk exposure to any authoritarian regime like the capital? Why trust a civilization that had already destroyed itself once? And if there were indeed other powers more advanced or even better organized than Panem, one must wonder, why didn't they intervene? The absence of any external interference suggests that no such force existed, or at least, none strong or stable enough to pose a challenge. Conversely, if the capital had encountered less developed or fragmented survivor societies, it would almost certainly have absorbed them, just as it did with the original districts, integrating them into its structure and exploiting their resources, through the same mechanisms of control and dependence. All of this points to a single, sobering conclusion. Panem may have been one of the last surviving powers on Earth, if not the last entirely. Even after decades of quiet obedience and apparent stability, a tipping point was inevitable. The capital system, though seemingly unshakable, had always been inherently fragile, not because it lacked control, but because it was built on a foundation of enforced dependence, rather than mutual trust or genuine legitimacy. For years, the districts labored under the illusion of necessity, providing the capital with everything it needed to sustain its wealth, luxury, and technological supremacy. But over time, as generations passed and quiet discontent turned into awareness, the truth began to surface. The capital did not merely rely on the districts, it exploited them. It prospered on the backs of those forced to live in poverty and hardship. And when the people finally began to question their assigned roles, to see the imbalance not as fate but as injustice, resistance became inevitable. Thus began the Dark Days. The Dark Days marked the first large-scale uprising against the capital, an explosive and desperate attempt by the districts to break free from generations of exploitation and control. Fueled by mounting starvation and the realization that their labor sustained a system designed to oppress them, several districts rose in coordinated rebellion. Districts like 1 and 2 had far more to lose than others. Their close ties to the capital granted them privileges, protection, and a higher standard of living. While the outer districts suffered under harsh conditions and strict control, these inner districts became deeply entwined with the capital's infrastructure, economically, culturally, and militarily. It is no surprise that during the First Rebellion they remained loyal to the regime, not out of ignorance, but because they were among the few who benefited from its survival. What followed was a brutal and protracted conflict. The capital responded with overwhelming force, deploying advanced weapons, cutting supply lines, and isolating the districts from one another to prevent unified resistance. The war devastated the land, cost countless lives, and ultimately ended in the capital's victory. District 13, once a key military asset, vanished underground and was presumed destroyed. In the aftermath, the capital introduced the Hunger Games as both punishment and warning, to ensure such defiance would never happen again. The Hunger Games weren't just a punishment for a past rebellion. They were a carefully designed system, built to control, not just to punish. They were created to spread fear, to crush resistance, and to remind everyone that the capital was in charge, always. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about sending a message. Every single year, through the reaping and the games, the capital reminded the people that standing up had a cost, and that cost was their children. By turning the rebellion into a ritual, something that had to be remembered in pain and blood, the capital changed how people saw it. It was no longer about courage or freedom, it became a mistake, one too painful to repeat. And maybe the most dangerous part of the games wasn't the violence, it was what the games did to how people saw each other. The districts didn't just lose their children, they had to watch them fight each other to the death. The capital made sure no one could ever feel united again. Each community was left with guilt, anger and grief. And they turned it inward, or against each other. That's why the capital didn't need soldiers on every corner. They had already done the real work, inside people's minds. The Hunger Games weren't just a show, they were psychological warfare. Pain became part of the system, division became normal, and the capital didn't need to keep fighting a war, because it had already won one that never had to be fought again. In the end, the capital didn't fall because it was beaten in battle. Its army was still there, its tech still worked. It still watched the districts, just like before. What it lost, quietly and for good, was something even more important. The belief that it had the right to rule. For the first time in generations, people began to imagine something different. A world without fear, without control. They started asking the questions they were never allowed to ask. Does order really have to come from fear? Does survival really mean giving up freedom? And is freedom really that dangerous? At first, it was just thought, then it became a need, and eventually it became a movement. The districts didn't rise just to tear down the capital. They rose because they finally believed they didn't have to be ruled. It wasn't just a political fight, it was something deeper, a shift in the way people saw the world. After years of control, of propaganda, of forced dependence, they weren't just fighting for land or power, they were fighting to take their lives back, to remember what it means to choose, to live under their own terms, maybe for the first time ever. That's the real story of Panem, not one of war or weapons, but of how power can quietly take everything, if it looks like safety, of how fear can feel like stability, and how people can forget they ever had a choice at all. And how hard, but how necessary, it is to take that choice back once you have learned to live without it. Panem wasn't built on revolution or a shared vision. It became out of collapse, fear and survival. People didn't choose it. They just didn't think they had another choice. The capital was never voted in. It wasn't based on public will or democratic values. It rose in the empty space left behind when the old world fell apart. It was shaped by crisis, powered by inequality, and held together through control. When everything broke down, the same forces that once created global inequality, things like corporate power, hoarded technology, and limited access to knowledge, didn't disappear. They just took new shape. The powerful didn't fall with the rest of the world. They pulled back into safe zones, places protected by location, technology, and resources that no one else had anymore. And from there, they built something new. But it wasn't better. It was colder, more efficient, more controlled. The capital wasn't a fresh start. It was everything that had already gone wrong, just more concentrated. It didn't need to conquer in the usual way. It simply stepped in with order while the rest of the world was burning. And for people who had lost everything, That seemed like enough. So, while the district struggled, starved, and bled, the capital became the only place that could still offer food, medicine, tools, or technology. But there was a price: submission. The capital didn't present itself as a dictatorship, it sold itself as salvation. And the longer the system held, the more people forgot what life had looked like before. History was rewritten, education was replaced. Ideas like freedom, faith, or democracy were either twisted or erased. The capital didn't just control supplies, it controlled what was real. Its greatest power wasn't in its weapons or wealth, it was in its ability to decide what life was supposed to be, and what it wasn't. People didn't ask what was right anymore, they asked what would keep them alive. And in that world, survival became the only truth that mattered. Districts were separated, unable to talk to each other or to organize. They gave in, one by one, not because they were weak, but because the system left no room for anything else. Dependence became normal, obedience became identity, and over time, even the idea of freedom started to sound like a fantasy. It was the same inequality that had once shaped the old world that allowed the capital to build its new one. Instead of ending with a collapse, that imbalance was used, even strengthened. Panem wasn't just something that rose from the ashes, it was something that profited from them. That's how it began, and that's why no one stopped it. Because when the world ends, people don't ask for justice, they ask for order. And the people gave them just enough structure to feel like it was the only way forward. But even something that feels inevitable can break. The capital didn't fall because it ran out of force. It fell because people stopped believing in it. Somewhere along the way, people remembered, surviving isn't the same as living free. That memory grew into a thought, then a demand, and finally into a fight. And they won. Thank you so much for watching, guys, and for staying with me through this deep dive into the origins of Panem. This project was more than just an exploration of a fictional world, it was a way to reflect on how power, fear and survival shape societies, both imagined and real. If you found this kind of analysis interesting, or if you would like to see more content that explores these foundations of worlds, let me know in the comments. There's still so much left to uncover about Panem, about other universes, and maybe even about our own in some perspective. Until then, thank you again for your time, your curiosity and your open mind. Stay thoughtful, and may the odds be ever in your favor.